Hi, and welcome to Axel Bank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Corey Brettschneider, the author of The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. He's a professor at Brown University. Corey, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to the conversation, Evan. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The president has jobs that the Constitution makes clear-cut. They are to manage the military, make appointments to other high offices, and ensure that federal law is being enforced. There are also hints that they can't go too far, but they're just hints, lest they be impeached. And it is clear, at least it should be, that they must leave office when their term expires. There are federal laws and a few amendments that specify everyone must have the right to vote, but apparently those haven't been enough to lead all 46 presidents down that small d Democratic path. Before we get to the stories of the 5 presidents that you profile, Corey, what clues or hints does the Constitution give to the president that defending democracy is part of the job?
Well, I think you should read the Constitution. You need to read it for a theme. And the way I read it, and part of the argument of the book is not everyone has read it this way. These presidents who threaten democracy read it in a very different way, in an authoritarian way. But the democratic reading, I think, comes first of all from the oath itself. The Article 1, of course, creates Congress and provides its powers and limits. Article 2, the presidency and its powers and limits, and Article 3, the judiciary. And Article 2 gives us a clue in how to read it as a democratic document in the oath clause. The oath clause tells the president what to say, what mandates, what has to be said the first few seconds in office, and what has to be said is the president has to pledge to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, not to do whatever he or she wants, not to have absolute power, as Donald Trump claimed, and Article 2 gives him the right to do. And it's about limits. It's about respect for the rule of law and for the Constitution. So that's one clue. And then I think if you read elsewhere, the book really talks about the different democratic pillars of the Constitution that had to be defended. And the first section of the book, after I do talk about the oath clause and George Washington's shout out to it in the second inaugural, where he said, really outlines the idea of the office by saying, look, I just took the oath of office. If I violate it, subject me to criticism, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And if I really violate it, subject me to constitutional punishment. The idea is the law is the fundamental idea in the country, not the person who occupies the office as opposed to the person. But I think most important place where we see a democratic idea of the Constitution is in the First Amendment, in its guarantee of free speech. And in the modern interpretation of the First Amendment, its free speech clause in particular, also its petition clause and assembly clauses, I think, which are related. But the speech clause in particular, its modern interpretation has been made famous by Alexander Meiklejohn, and the Supreme Court has really said Meiklejohn's interpretation is the right one. And what he tried to emphasize is that what the First Amendment means is a democratic entitlement to speak, because without it, we couldn't hear arguments that are against us. We couldn't make arguments. We couldn't have a democracy. So voting matters in democracy, but equally important is the right to free speech. Now, I mentioned Meiklejohn as a modern interpreter, but that comes from somewhere. And what I argue in the book is that it comes from the resistance to John Adams' attempt to shut down. The First Amendment understood the free speech clause as a right to dissent. It was really the newspaper editors that did that.
One of the things that I think is so interesting is that even great presidents have done anti-democratic things that historians have vigorously criticized. FDR, I'll give you a few examples. I mean, you know these, but FDR forced citizens into domestic concentration camps, for the lack of a better term. People who are in them say that's exactly what they are. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War Teddy Roosevelt kicked a group of black soldiers out of the military after these kind of shadowy charges against them over a riot. Are presidents drunk on power, or is the job too powerful to do properly? I guess, in other words, is the problem the president's, or is the problem the job?
I think it's both. That look, the presidency, the way I argue it, is not just powerful now, but has always been enormously powerful. It's the only branch of government that really combines the representation of the entire American people with one office. And it combines sometimes with people who go into politics, as you well know, often have huge egos. And so when you get that combination, it's dangerous. Where it gets really dangerous, and this is the case with all of my five, is when the ego, the power of the office, combines with what I call an authoritarian idea of the Constitution. So if you
Given
take Adams, for instance, even though I just gave you an argument for what I'm calling the modern argument for understanding free speech, he had a very, very different idea. He thought the president was there as a kind of constitutional monarch, not subject to the sovereignty of the people. He didn't think we, the people, grounded the president's power. And so he thought that when it came to criticism of him, that of course that wasn't protected any more than criticism of King was. So in these presidents, it's partly the presidency itself, partly personality and ego, but it also is a kind of sophisticated authoritarianism. Trump is not sophisticated, for instance, in his constitutional thinking, but Adams certainly was. He was one of the premier constitutional thinkers of his time, but he used that idea in a way that was not certain by his own self-understanding, wasn't democratic. He read the Constitution as a kind of document continuous with a kind of monarchy.
given all 46 presidents have done at least something that historians or democracy watchdogs would find questionable, and probably enough to write a book about each one, how did you settle on these five of Adams, Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, Wilson, and Nixon?
Well, it really goes to your first question, which is in the same way that we can look at democratic parts of the Constitution. So I mentioned the Oath Clause, I mentioned free speech. I'll also mention the idea of equal protection of law, and the idea fundamental to all of it, that a president is not above the law. Those to me are what I call not just any parts of the Constitution. They are the fundamental pillars of democracy, such that if you don't have them, you don't have a democracy at all. So what I'm looking at is not just presidents who, as you say, and I think we could probably do this for everyone, did something that violated a part of the Constitution, but really had an idea of an authoritarian constitution that would collapse democracy itself. That's what's unique about all of these. So in Adams, for instance, and I know, Adams is lauded, with McCullough famously and others, the miniseries, people love Adams. And they think of him as a great president, partly because he was such a prominent scholar and his role in drafting the Declaration. But, think about what he did. It wasn't just some violation of the Constitution. He saw to it that the Sedition Act was passed, and then he used it to try to shut down the opposition party. And he did that in retaliation for a plot being published and uncovered by these editors who he was seeking to prosecute, his political opponents, that would have undermined the transition of power. That was an attempt to create a committee that would stop electoral votes from being certified. Sounds familiar from what the plot in January 6th. It's very, very eerily similar. So what is it about that makes it different from other constitutional violations? It wasn't in the service of some greater good. It really was an attempt to end the opposition party. We would never have gotten off the ground as a democracy without multi-party democracy. And so these aren't just, here's this president did this wrong or this president did that right. And a lot of historians have kind of tried to talk about it that way. These are attacks on the fundamental idea of democracy itself. And in the case of Buchanan and Johnson, in the sort of second iteration, America was not a multiracial democracy at the founding, and there was a question as to whether we would ever become one. The opposite of multiracial democracy is a slave society. And what Buchanan did secretly was lobby the Supreme Court to decide the most evil decision ever rendered, and
Yeah,
that's
so
the Dred Scott case.
I want to go through all five of them. I
Sure,
think you've
sure.
covered Adams pretty well there.
Yeah,
What struck me is that, he actually prosecuted people, more than 100 people,
yeah,
126,
right. Yes,
um,
yeah.
over this. So just explain how these prosecutions took place and what his justification was.
Well, I mean, I think the justification goes back to, I mean, the story in the book is it's a combination of all of these things. It's a question of power and ego, and most dangerously, the authoritarian idea of the Constitution. So, just start with a kind of tidbit, which is that um, uh, there was the Federalist Party was involved in a plot, and the plot, which was really discussed on the floor of Congress, so it wasn't secret in the way you might think it was to create a committee that would essentially keep electoral votes from being certified in the election of 1800. And then newspaper editors, the press is very fragmented, very partisan, report on this. And they report actually about what's happening in Congress, in the congressional record. And that gives rise to both the end of that plot, but this idea that the opposition press is too dangerous and that it's bent on, it's destabilizing the United States. Now, it's partisan in this isn't some sort of worry about, offensive speech or something like that. It really is partisan in its design. And just to show you how partisan it was, look, I'll just tell you what the legislation says. It says that if you criticize the president of the United States, you're subject to criminal prosecution for criminal libel. And if you criticize the vice president, Thomas Jefferson, and as listeners will know, a member of a different party, it's fine. And so Jefferson, these editors are, and this isn't just legislation on the books, it isn't just a threat. Many of them are prosecuted, as you say, as many as 126. One of the people prosecuted is not an editor, it's a sitting opposition congressman, Matthew Leon from Vermont. So this isn't just some abstract law about a limit on speech. It really is a law that's wielded by Adams' administration as Attorney General to go after political opponents. And I detail how they fought back. If that was the end of the story, that's why I say this isn't just any constitutional violation. We might never have had a multi-party democracy. The Federalists might have taken power. They wouldn't be subject to, might have kept power. They wouldn't be subject to any of the checks of the press that we think of. But the editors who were prosecuted, when you mess with the press, they really use their own trials brilliantly to advertise the idea that this was a violation of a democratic idea of the Constitution, a democratic right to free speech. And so it's partly this political story, but I guess what I want to emphasize is if you read Adams' work, his philosophical approach to the Constitution as a whole includes a special role for the president that's different than the House of Representatives. And that's that the president is really a kind of constitutional monarch there for stability. And so while the House of Representatives is elected and accountable to the people, he really doesn't think we, the people, hold the president to account in the way that now I think it's assumed. Instead, he thinks of the president as a kind of constitutional monarch. So those are the different levels: ego, power, but also this philosophical thing. When we laud him for being such a brilliant thinker, it's not a good kind of thinking. It's an authoritarian kind, and that's his self-understanding. That's not some slam of him or secret reading. And mainstream historians like Gordon Wood have pointed that out, and also defenders of Adams, I should say, like Eric Nelson at Harvard, has a great book about the kind of history of he wouldn't call it authoritarian, but a monarchist idea of the Constitution.
James Buchanan, you mentioned, your words in the book are he colluded with the Supreme Court to deny constitutional personhood to African Americans. I think a lot of people know the Dred Scott decision, but explain the collusion part of it. How much communication was going on between Buchanan and the justices in the lead up to this decision being issued?
Yeah, and he's probably, historians know Buchanan is bad, but I think not in the way that I'm trying to point out. And popular historians, this is what the story I'm telling is well known by specialists in this era, and Buchanan and Dred Scott. I'm not the first to say it, but what I show is that doing two things. One is publicly proclaiming neutrality on the issue of whether or not there is a protection for the enslavement of other human beings in the Constitution. And he's really saying on the question of the national protection of slavery, I'm going to leave this to the Supreme Court. This is a constitutional issue. That's the branch that decides it. And so in his inaugural, for instance, that's what he says. But we know now that secretly, and Frederick Douglass and others were worried about this. They were onto it. But now we know it really happened. There's correspondence going on between him and the justices. And what he's really saying is, look, if you use this case, the Dred Scott case, to say the most radical pro-slavery thing you could say, which is essentially that Black Americans are not citizens under the federal Constitution, and paving the way for the idea that property rights include nationally the right to enslave other human beings and deny essentially anywhere in America the even legal personhood is the phrase that I use to describe it of Black Americans. I'll support you. And now why does that matter? Because the court on its own is pretty weak. It's famously called the least dangerous branch, but combined with the power of a president, it's extremely powerful. If you have two branches on your side like that, that's a problem. So these aren't just, hey, I'm a fan. They're not fan letters. They're really a green light to doing, the unthinkable. And when I say the most evil decision, I really do think this decision it's so horrendous, because what it does is it erases the idea that when the Constitution says in its preamble, we the people, that it includes Black Americans. And that is sort of the pivot point for where the resistance to Buchanan and the Dred Scott case come. Frederick Douglass, like the newspaper editors, fights back. And how does he fight back? He says, it doesn't say we the white people. That's his quote. It says we the people. So it's a great question at the beginning, like which parts of the Constitution have democracy as opposed to authoritarianism in it? And how did that democratic reading get going? And we talked about the Oath Clause, free speech, and now that idea of we the people, not we the white people, I think is another central place.
Andrew Johnson's your next president. You say that he urged violence and tried to guarantee a white supremacist republic. And I think, by the way, if people read about the era after the Civil War, there is an enormous push for civil rights, and there's an enormous movement that Black Americans start getting elected to office in the South, and there's a real concerted effort to stop violence from happening. But in the end, those forces, the white supremacist forces, become stronger and truly enact, another 60, 80 years of white supremacy, especially across the South, but in lots of places. So how did Andrew Johnson try to spur that movement?
In the Adams story, the book is about, of course, the danger of the presidency. And it's about these authoritarian presidents who really do threaten democracy, not just any part of it, but the fundamental pillars of it. And the story is also about the patterns of recovery. So in the first instance, Adams threatens the right to free speech as a right to dissent. The newspaper editors don't just fight back, they elect subsequent presidents that really restore the right to free speech. So Jefferson says, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, meaning I'm not going to prosecute my opponents. And Madison, most importantly, refuses to prosecute dissenters to the War of 1812, even though there are calls to do so. So there's a restoration there of the right to dissent. And that does happen, importantly, after the Dred Scott case in Buchanan. Lincoln, at the behest of Douglas in part, really goes from a view that's, I'd say, not as anti-slavery as we remember him as when he's elected, to certainly an anti-slavery view in supporting the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation. But the recovery is partial here. It's Buchanan, and Lincoln is a partial recovery president. Douglas says about him, he was still a white man's president because he didn't advocate the thing clearly that was really needed, which is an equal right to vote for Black people. He made steps towards it. For instance, talking about the right to vote of Black soldiers, but he never endorsed the idea that Douglas calls of equal citizenship. So there's a partial recovery, but there's a huge pushback, which is that in the midst of this recovery, you get his vice president after his assassination, Andrew Johnson, who is an avowedly, and this again isn't my words, it's his self-understanding, a white supremacist president. And when he's confronted by Douglas, who thinks, I'll work with you as I worked with Lincoln, in my dialogues with Lincoln, I brought him around towards this idea of equal citizenship. Basically, Johnson makes it very clear, no way, that I am not going to be a president of civil rights. And he does everything he can to oppose Reconstruction. His idea is really not to bring back slavery, but to bring it back under a different name, an idea of second-class citizenship. But the remarkable thing is that even in the midst of this kind of threat within a recovery, that the recovery continues for a period of time. And that's seen partly in the impeachment, which is really an attempt to bring Johnson's white supremacy to light. It isn't done perfectly because it's twisted with all sorts of arcane details about the firing of a pro-Reconstruction, pro-civil rights Secretary of War. But in the end, the bottom line is that Johnson is so disgraced in his attempt to bring back slavery under a different name that he doesn't even get the nomination of his own party. And most importantly, in this point, there is an election of Ulysses Grant, who is up to that point, certainly the most pro-civil rights president of all time. And his importance is that he really doesn't just enact Douglas's idea of equal citizenship through his support of the 15th Amendment, but that he supports and sees used what are known as the enforcement acts, the acts to enforce the 15th Amendment. So that means really over 1,000 prosecutions of white terrorists of the Ku Klux Klan, using in part what's known as the Ku Klux Klan Act to go after these terrorists. So Johnson, and Buchanan certainly do threaten democracy, and it's a warning of how fragile civil rights are in America. And there's a longer term story, of course, about the failure to really realize civil rights in any meaningful way until the Truman and Lyndon Johnson administrations. But there is, and these are cycles. There is a cycle of recovery that you get to in the Grant era from Buchanan and more immediately from Andrew Johnson.
The next president you profile is Woodrow Wilson. And what's amazing about it is that for decades, really, I mean, President Kennedy often spoke so glowingly about Wilson. He was considered one of the greats. Over the last 15, 20 years, maybe even 10 years, maybe less than that, the Wilson reputation has really disintegrated. His name was pulled off of the school that he was the actual president of. So, Wilson has seen a major, if he's watching us, he's seen a major a drop in his approval rating. He resegregated the federal government. He made it worse. Explain how he did that.
I'll say too, America generally wasn't aware of the awfulness of some of these presidents. I talked about Adams and the kind of hagiographic way of talking about how brilliant he was, ignoring the fact that he really did try to shut down the opposition party. Buchanan's was known in some ways as a bad president, but not the extent, I think, of his involvement in the Dred Scott case. Johnson was defended by John F. Kennedy, who called his impeachment, political disgrace, essentially, and profiles in courage. And that was not by accident. It was because Wilson and his cohort of historians, and he was, of course, a professor of politics and history at Princeton and president of Princeton. They really rewrote history when it came to Reconstruction to try to make those who were pushing for civil rights look like the bad guys. Grant, for instance, is profiled as a drunk by them to try to de-emphasize the importance of his civil rights agenda. And Wilson himself really got erased. And what's unique about him is that, of course, there was racism in America before Wilson. But what he tried to do, and this is part of his ideology, was to nationalize white supremacy. And he was a progressive president in the sense that he thought there should be an increased powerful role for the federal government. He was a constitutional scholar who emphasized the presidency as a kind of first among equals because of the president being elected by the American people as a whole. And his specific things that he did, which include the resegregation of the federal government, and the resegregation of the military, really are part of what I tried to show through his lecture notes, for instance, and the lecture notes of his students, an ideology of nationalism combined with white supremacy. Specifically, what Wilson thought philosophically about the Constitution was that it was a document devoted to efficiency. And integration was inefficiency. And he used the term friction to talk about integration. And we have to minimize friction in order to create efficiency at all costs. And what that means is segregation and a nationalization of segregation. If the national constitution is about efficiency and friction is its opposite, segregation is essential nationally. I found pretty shocking things in the lecture notes. For instance, the reference to the postbellum amendments and the 15th Amendment not really adding any rights to the Constitution, that they just affirm the idea of state sovereignty. So he was really simultaneously trying to erase the gains of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery and the badges and incidents of slavery, things that are slavery-like, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and of course the idea of the right to vote regardless of race, that to minimize those things, get rid of them in favor of a national idea of white supremacy. And Birth of a Nation is another thing that people have rightly focused on, but I go further in the book than I think anybody has in trying to show what Birth of a Nation, the author of The Klansman was a comrade, a colleague of Wilson at Johns Hopkins, where he did his PhD. And if you look at The Klansman, you look at Birth of a Nation, the film based on The Klansman, it really is a lot of the imagery from Wilson's textbook, which is about how the Klan wasn't great, but they were sort of necessary evil in order to further white supremacy throughout the country.
I just read the introduction to a book that I was sent from a publisher, and the book, it looks like it's going to be pretty harsh on Wilson in terms of race, but the introduction says that there have been 2,000 books written on Wilson, and that most of them have missed this whole story.
Yeah, well, it's a story I tell, so I think I beat whoever this author is. I will say something personal just about myself, because I don't want to make myself out to be like, oh, I knew this all the time. Really, I had the idea for the book, and I got deep into the archives and deep into, and I was finding things that went way beyond what I thought. I mean, when I was a graduate student at Princeton, and at the time the Wilson School still existed, I did my PhD in politics, which is a sort of connected to the Wilson School but different. And when I got married, I was married in his house, in Prospect House, where he lived, and I was so proud to be married and have my wedding. And then, wow, that turned out not to be, not to be the Wilson I thought there was.
You got to get your wedding photos and like Photoshop in like Frederick Douglass's house or something like that, or like a pro-democracy person. All right, the last president, just briefly tell us about Nixon. I would say poor Nixon, but it's his fault. He winds up in these books all the time about the president who just went so far in going after democracy that he has earned his place, I guess, in the books that describe this stuff. He famously said, and now I guess more than ever, when the president does it, it's not illegal. He ordered the break-in at Watergate. How important is it, though, to view this not just as a political move, but as an anti-democratic move?
Yeah, I think that's the part that's lost, that there's such a focus on Watergate and the break-in that we miss the way in which he really attacked dissidents, the dissenters, in the way that Adams did. And so I have in the book, I think one of the last interviews with Daniel Ellsberg about the entire Nixon episode. And I tell the story that Nixon's crimes were so much more vast than Watergate. There was an attempt, for instance, to incapacitate Ellsberg in the Capitol steps, which he described in the interview and which is backed up by Watergate prosecutors. There was an attempt, and you can hear this on him say this on the tape, telling Kissinger that he wants the Watergate, he wants the safe at the Brookings Institution broken into because he thinks there's more documents like the Pentagon Papers that are going to disgrace him and his administration. When he's told, well, look, Mr. President, you can get this stuff through legal means, he says, no, I want it done, and this is a quote, on a thievery basis. That's how. So the crimes are vast. They're directly connected to democracy. And as was the case with Adams, he justifies it ideologically. So that line is well known. And when a president does it, it's not illegal. But I think less understood is that isn't just a, like, you can't handle the truth moment. He's really explaining America's in a civil war, and the protesters are, like the Confederates. And that gives me enormous power to do whatever I want. And so, when I'm acting to protect the nation, in my view, I can do it and I'm immune from prosecution. That might have sounded like a crazy view, except the Supreme Court essentially, unfortunately, just agreed with him by protecting
The title
from prosecution former and current sitting presidents from prosecution for official acts. So my point, though, about Nixon is that the thing I think that makes the book different is that I've talked about recoveries in each of these instances. The recovery from Adams, never by the Supreme Court, by the way. The Supreme Court almost always makes it worse. Samuel Chase in the Adams episode lobbies for the Sedition Act. He sees to it that many of these editors aren't able to even raise the issue of free speech. But there's a recovery, in each of them. The recovery from Adams with Jefferson and Madison, from Buchanan with Lincoln, but really Grant. And the recovery from Wilson comes during Truman and Lyndon Johnson. What's different about Nixon is we really didn't recover. That part of my argument is, that argument, and this, here, I'll give myself a little credit because it was before the immunity decision, but it basically predicts exactly what the Supreme Court said, that we never got, because the grand jury, which really were the citizens in that instance that tried to push back, voted in a straw poll to indict him, some with two hands, as one of them, legal secretary Elaine Edlund says. They were defeated, these grand jurors, because they were convinced to delay the prosecution until after he left office, and then the pardon stopped him. So we never recovered in that. We never saw a criminal president, Nixon in particular, be prosecuted. And so there hasn't been the kind of recovery from Nixon that hasn't. That's a very different way of telling the story than many historians do, because they tell it as one in which the institutions held. I tell it as one in which the institutions remain vulnerable in the way we were during Nixon. And, I'm sorry to say it, but that really has been borne out by this Supreme Court decision and by the threat to democracy that Trump still poses.
The title of your book is The Presidents and the People. So talk about the thread that you picked up here about the ordinary citizens who counter them. You don't have to go through each one, but just explain why it's important for all of us to recognize the fact that presidents who threaten democracy can indeed be countered by regular people.
Yes, citizens have stopped these presidents who threaten democracy. And my point in writing the book, it's not just a book about history, it's partly that, largely that, but it's also a book to inspire for the future, because these presidents weren't victorious. They were stopped. And in the case of John Adams, it wasn't the court, it wasn't Congress, it wasn't the traditional checks on power. Patrick Henry, as I say in the book, predicted that these traditional checks wouldn't work, and he worried about democracy collapsing. So why didn't it collapse if the traditional checks didn't work? And the reason is that those who often found themselves under threat fought back and won. And the way they won is important. It wasn't through court cases. It was through organizing democratic constitutional constituencies, trying to rescue a democratic idea of the Constitution from an authoritarian one. And so the newspaper editors in that first instance, the very same people who were being prosecuted by Adams, turned the election of 1800 into a referendum on democracy. And in electing Jefferson, they made his issue, and Madison's also subsequently, free speech, the right to dissent. In the case of the second iteration, Buchanan and Andrew Johnson, those presidents were effectively opposed. There was a debate among abolitionists. In fact, the mainstream, Lloyd Garrison, said, Constitution is essentially a pact with the devil. Let's burn it, get rid of it. And what Frederick Douglass, the hero of that section, said was, the Constitution itself, in its principles, is democratic and can be saved. And that's the tool we need to wield against these authoritarian presidents. And so the greatest moment is partly the dialogues with Lincoln. And I talk about how really Douglas convinced Lincoln to adopt a much more democratic idea of the Constitution than what he had. But the high point is that Grant administration and those prosecutions of the Ku Klux Klan that I mentioned earlier. And that story is really not the court coming in and saving everyone. Far from it. It's through citizens demanding the election of a majorly pro-Reconstruction president, and the example of Grant. And in the Wilson case, the recovery takes decades. And Brown versus Board of Ed is the case that we're taught in school. Everyone knows that. But the story I tell is much earlier. It's the role of Sadie Alexander, the first Black woman to receive a PhD in economics, and the way that she really used a citizens committee to create an agenda for real recovery. And as important as Brown is, the thing that really worked in not just Alexander's report, the report of that committee resulted in Truman being convinced to undo the executive, to create an executive order to desegregate the federal government, to undo some of Wilson's damage. But there was a lot more to be done, some of which was done in the Brown case. But the most important thing in desegregation, the thing that worked, is Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which threatens to withdraw federal funds from schools, public schools that refuse to desegregate. And that was really the brainchild of this unknown hero, Sadie Alexander. So in each of these, there are these citizens fighting back. And in the Nixon case, there was an attempt to fight back. Ellsberg himself, the grand jury, but it's an ongoing need to recover the idea that a president is not above the law. So we did recover the idea of free speech, the idea of equal protection. And those gains, although they're under threat, remain. But the thing that we haven't done yet, and what we need a future movement to do, is to regain the idea that a president is not above the law and can be subject to prosecution if the president, in fact, commits crimes.
Of the 5 presidents who you looked at, which president, I'm curious, was the hardest to get great source material on?
Well, I mean, the Wilson story that I wanted to tell, as you said, is not well known. And I love that statistic that if you read books, it just didn't fit with the things that I was finding. So one of the things that really was a breakthrough was I got a tip about at Princeton that the notebooks of the students in Wilson's class were preserved. And I thought to myself, if you really want to know what Wilson thought, these notebooks are going to have a story in them. And so it took me time to figure all this out. But when I found those notebooks, they were pretty incredible. It took time, but also digging into Adams' letters was also helpful. Getting the details of the Buchanan lobbying of the Supreme Court, what exactly happened? What did the letters say?
Yeah, how did you find
time.
that? Where are those papers housed?
It's second. There are, some of these things were known, although not in popular history, but by professional historians. So there is a group of historians that went and found these letters. And so, of course, I went and checked the primary documents, but it was in the secondary literature in the Buchanan case about the details of lobbying the justices.
What's interesting to me is 3 of these 5 presidents who you look at, we're talking about here, Buchanan, Johnson, and Wilson. In particular, their anti-democratic moves were about race. What does that tell you about how, for the lack of a better word, confounding race has been for this country, and in particular, the people leading it?
Yeah, a lot of the book is about race because the threat to democracy, I think, throughout American history has been, of course, first of all, the idea of that we had a Declaration of Independence proclaiming equality, and then the institution of enslavement alongside it. To me, that is the original sin of America, and the question of whether or not the Constitution can be saved. Free speech, of course, without that, we don't even get off the ground. But we don't get to anything like a real democracy without ending not just the question of enslavement of other human beings, but the remnants of it, the second-class citizenship question. And so throughout the book, if I think of one idea that I'm trying to wrestle with, it's whether or not the Constitution can be saved, given its original sin and the remnants of it. And rather than me tell you, yes, the Constitution can be saved, the point of the book is when you look at these citizen heroes, they tell you. So Frederick Douglass, I think, really is the founder of American democracy, even though he's not an 18th century founder, because he learns to read, he teaches us, I should say, to read the Constitution as a democratic document, to read the Declaration and the Constitution's proclamation of we the people, as I said, not we the white people, its prohibition on inheriting the sins of parents, the corruption of blood, and bills of attainder. He uses those ideas to try to tease out a democratic principle. And that's really a remarkable moment. He's like the editors in that, but of course the editors didn't champion the idea of a multiracial democracy. And Douglass doesn't just do it himself, it's that he creates a tradition that others then follow in. So the initial resistance to Woodrow Wilson comes in real time from William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells. And they're saying to Wilson a lot of what Douglas had written about and spoken about, that this is a constitution of equality. Wilson, in a dramatic confrontation with them when they're calling out his segregation of the federal government, that was known at the time and certainly known by them, Wilson says back to them almost verbatim from Plessy versus Ferguson, if you think segregation is second-class citizenship, you're imposing that. That's in your psychology. That's not inherent in segregation, which is just about reducing friction. That's his way of putting it. And they really echo Douglas, and they say, no, the Constitution is about anti-subordination, an idea of true equality and equal democracy. And in that moment, they're doing what Douglas said. So that democratic idea of the Constitution, don't take my word for it. Read the heroes, really, that we haven't seen as the heroes of the Constitution. Now, there is a tradition that looks at race a completely different way, that buys the Garrison line. In fact, I think it's increasing in academia, that says, scrap the Constitution. It's a pact with the devil. And I'm trying to say, if you look at these heroes, these constitutional heroes, they really redefine the Constitution as a democratic idea.
Which presidents are on the other side of this? Who are the true patrons of democracy among the 46 that we've had?
I think in that first iteration, Jefferson, of course, is always mixed. Of course, on the question of slavery, he's a slave owner. He's famously, at best, a hypocrite, and really much worse than that. And on the question of free speech, he's publicly proclaiming we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, but he's secretly seeking the prosecutions of his opponents. So I'd hesitate to call him a hero. I mean, it is a recovery in that he never returns the Sedition Act. He allows it to expire. He publicly says the right thing. But Madison is really a free speech hero. The War of 1812, he had the option to say an easy thing, which is, I'm going to pass a new Sedition Act. If you oppose the war, you're threatening democracy, you're threatening the stability of the republic. And he doesn't do it. And why doesn't he do it? I think because he really sees himself accountable to that idea that brought about the electoral revolution against the Federalist Party, the election of the Democratic Republicans, and that's about the right to dissent. Lincoln, I admire so much, of course, because he really transforms under pressure from Douglas. There's a worry, too, that, of course, England might enter the war on the side of the South. But he goes from someone who is not a president devoted to equal citizenship for Black Americans in any way, to one who comes much closer to that. But Grant is really the hero of that second cluster of crisis and then recovery presidents. In the third, partly Truman, who really is chosen because he uses the N-word according to a family. Really, there's an attempt to shore up Southern Democratic conservatives on what issues of race. And yet, when he hears the story from the NAACP and Walter White and other leaders about Black soldiers returning to America and being beaten severely, something clicks. Not intellectually, it's not like Adams and this sophisticated idea of the Constitution, just emotionally, that this is wrong. And the reason why the NAACP and the citizens really are the hero of that story is they capitalize on it. They tell him it's not enough to feel bad. You have to do something. And so they convince him to appoint the Citizens Commission that includes the brilliant Sadie Alexander. So Truman, I think, in many ways deserves much more respect on the issue of civil rights than he's sometimes given. And then, of course, Lyndon Johnson and that partnership with Martin Luther King. That combination is a heroic moment in the recovery of American politics, because although, of course, Johnson becomes so tied up in the war that destroys his presidency, he is, in his early presidency, working with King, and King sees from Douglas and others that he's got to make civil rights about the Constitution. It can't be about theology, which is how he starts off. It has to be about the idea of anti-tyranny as he sees it. That combination is, it's always in pairs, right? It's not, these presidents don't just act nicely because they're good people or because they're virtuous. It's that they're responsive to the citizens who call for a democratic recovery.
What can we do either structurally in terms of the rules around the presidency or as citizens to make sure that whoever takes office next, we have Harris and Trump, they've both indicated different positions about the future of how democracy should look like, to say the least. But as we go forward here into the 21st century, how should we either refine the office or refine ourselves to push them more towards small d democracy?
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, early on in our conversation, I talked about George Washington, the second inaugural, said, I just took the oath of office, hold me to it. If I violate it, criticize me, subject me to constitutional punishment. If I really violate the Constitution, we've got to figure out how to restore that idea of the office. And the immunity decision, the idea that criminal presidents are really immune in office and even after they leave it for official acts, has to be reversed. That has to be the issue of the day. Thankfully, it's happening. I was just on MSNBC talking about this, and the president of the United States has called for a constitutional amendment to reverse the immunity decision. And Charles Schumer has gone further even than the president in saying that there has to be legislation. He thinks it can be done through legislation, not an amendment. And I agree, we should try that first, to say that not only former presidents, but sitting presidents can be prosecuted. And that's the way to really recover from Nixon in a way that we failed to. I talked about the grand jury in the book and described it to listeners, how they tried to indict Nixon and were stopped. We've got to make that possible. And so I'd love to see Joe Biden give a speech where he echoes the second inaugural, where he says, look, if I commit a crime, I'm the president, but I'm not above the law. I should be stopped. Subject me to punishment, criminal punishment, just like anyone else. And to also say, and if the next president, whether it's Trump or someone else, commits a crime, they also should be prosecuted. It's that simple. That's what the grand jurors, they didn't succeed in the kind of recovery that we needed to see, but they stopped Nixon. They handed the information that they got over to Congress. He did resign under the threat of impeachment. The Judiciary Committee voted up articles of impeachment. That was enough for him to resign. And we've got to continue that recovery, make them the heroes, honor them with legislation that says, yes, a sitting president can be indicted.
This book is dedicated to the memory of your mother-in-law, Virginia Weiss. I hope I'm saying that right. You say
Yes.
a champion of children's rights who believed in the power of committed citizens to realize the promises of democracy. First of all, like me, you have a fantastic mother-in-law, very lucky in that department. Children's rights, I was struck by that. Tell me about that. What does that mean?
Oh, thanks so much for asking about that, Evan. My mother-in-law passed away as the book was being finished. I talked to her often about it. Unfortunately, she never got to read it. But she really inspired it in many ways because she spent her career as a children's rights lawyer. She created a Guardian ad litem program in North Carolina, which was devoted to making sure that the interests of the most vulnerable of children were protected. She was an advocate for Native American rights when she was living in Massachusetts, and really had a celebrated career at public counsel in LA and other institutions in different places that she lived, championing the rights of children. And, she wasn't an elected official. She was a citizen, and she really made a difference. And so that's why these citizen stories to me really resonated with her memory.
You mentioned MSNBC. You've become a political commentator, not only thanks to your great work, but also because of the news of the day, where you're called frequently to comment on democracy and other things on national TV. How do you envision this playing out for you? Do you think you'll do another book? Do you want to do more TV commentating? What's next for you?
I really want the message of this book to get out. So for the next year or so, I'm going to be talking about these stories. And I think that, one of the keys that we need to do is in understanding the current moment. There is a threat to democracy, I should say. And it, was most evident in January 6th when Donald Trump engaged in a plot to disrupt the peaceful transition of power through a similar plan with the help of John Eastman, former law school dean, to deny the certification of electoral votes. That this wasn't just a riot at the Capitol, it was an attempt to stop the way the Constitution outlines for our democracy to proceed. It was a direct attack on democracy. But I think, too, we've got to see the danger of the presidency as a whole, and that's really what I think the book does in its stories of Adams and the other presidents that we've talked about in such depth. And so I'm trying to kind of reteach American history. Patrick Henry said at the founding, that don't ratify this Constitution. It's too dangerous. Why did he think that? Because the presidency itself was so powerful, he thought, that when we tried these traditional checks of the judiciary, of Congress, they wouldn't work. And the whole system could collapse, he thought. I really do think that. You could hear that, I think, in my voice, that we're at an inflection point, that these institutions are not guaranteed to work. And these recoveries that I've talked about are not guaranteed to happen. So I'm trying to use the book as a jumping off point to motivate citizens to recover our democracy. And that's what I'll be devoted to for the foreseeable future.
Corey Brettschneider, the author of The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Evan. Thanks for these great questions and for the in-depth look at these important pieces of history.
Well, thanks for being here. Check out the book and his social media feed on the website formerly known as Twitter at BrettschneiderC. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.